Hi, I'm Dani Castellano, and this is Diet Culture, the podcast where sometimes I interview amazing people and professionals in the field of healing relationships with food, and sometimes I chat with my brother and fellow human who also hates diet culture, Nick. We talk about diet culture, a systemic and oppressive force in all of our lives that wastes our time at best and destroys livelihood at worst. We dissect the problems, share stories, and give suggestions on where we can all go from here. This podcast is for informational, educational, and inspirational purposes only, and never a substitution for individual medical or nutritional advice. And today we are going to talk about eating disorders, specifically some myths that I have heard, that I've seen online, that I've seen in some education that I've done, and just work on busting those things to wrap up our series on why diet culture is spooky. Hey, Nick.
Hey, Dan. How's it going?
Pretty good. How are you?
I am doing well. I'm invigorated by that concise yet informative intro.
Oh, thanks so much. I try. I figure I should give everyone a mouse update in case they've been worried about me since last week.
Please.
And we haven't seen any signs of a mouse in several days. So I think,
Oh, that's very good.
yes, that the machine that we plugged in that makes this ultrasonic, is that the correct term, noise that mice hate, I think it's working.
Really?
Because why else did it disappear? We didn't catch it.
I mean, if I had options and there was something I didn't like, I would leave. So
Yeah. So,
seems to
or it could
check
be my
out.
peppermint swab, except for the mouse definitely walked over my peppermint swab.
That's tough.
Yeah.
But I believe we cut it out of the podcast. I don't believe it made last week's episode, but
oh, you cut it out when I was talking about my mouth?
No, that made the podcast. But there was a specific instance in which something was going on on my end. There was like a small. It was my girlfriend was back on the couch. She was like tapping something. There were a few tapping noises, and you freaked out, and you were like, well, not like freaked out, but you were like, "What's going on?" And I was like, "You were like, what's that noise?" And I was like, "It's just it's nothing." And you were like, "Oh, I thought it was a mouse," and we ended up cutting that. But just so that people know the severity of the issue and how much of a win it would be if your mice left you.
Yeah, I was unwell. I think that my maternal instincts have really like kicked into some kind of gear that just can't tolerate the killing of mice, and also can't tolerate something creating germs all over my kitchen counters.
That's funny. That is the first time I've ever heard of a pregnancy causing anything like that.
So we're going to talk about eating disorders today, and specifically myths that are common. This is a list of 8 myths that I want to cover today, and then there may be things that you've heard that we can add in, but there are things that I've heard often. There are things that come from some of the education that I've had in working towards getting my IADEP certification as a certified eating disorder dietitian. Some things just in like Googling eating disorder myths to see what kinds of things other people have heard. So that's how I came up with this list. But I thought this was a really perfect way to wrap up our series of why diet culture is spooky, because obviously, like, all parts of the spectrum of disordered eating and an unhealthy relationship with food is something that I really hold so much compassion for others in dealing with, and have such a fire in me to help others find the tools they need and to heal from this. But eating disorders are the thing that I show up to work every day to treat, and very serious and not very well understood issue. And so I want to tackle a little bit of that.
Please.
Yeah. So feel free to chime in as you as we go because I'm curious of things that you may have heard or just, like, may have misinterpreted because I think that just helps to, like, bring it together because I definitely did not know even having had an eating disorder, I didn't know a lot of things about them, going into this field. So I
Sounds good.
also wanna say that I certainly can only provide, like, part of like, I'm not a comprehensive eating disorder specialist because I am a dietitian, so, like, that is my lane. I certainly understand various parts, but if I had a psychiatrist and a therapist, which makes up the core team, in a higher level of care or hopefully all treatment of eating disorders, there probably would be a little bit more detail we can get into, but I just wanted to remind people that that's my lane, and I kinda stick to that, because it's ethical and that's what I do. Okay, so myth number 1, um, is that you can tell what someone is struggling with based on how they look. So in this specific instance, meaning, like, their body size. So eating disorders are really often perceived as being a disease that you can notice in someone. Someone, like, may look quote unquote anorexic because they appear too thin. And we hold an opinion that someone cannot have an eating disorder if they're in a larger body, or if they do have an eating disorder in a larger body, that they must struggle with overeating or with binge eating disorder. And this is just not true. And I think that we have to be careful about how we describe people, especially, like, in this context. So, I think if we were all to close our eyes and describe the first thing that pops into our minds of someone with an eating disorder, what is that for you?
It would be someone who is too skinny.
Mhm. Yeah.
Too is the just making
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah, definitely in quotes there, but kind of, an emaciated presenting body, I think is a good way to really, like, put that on the same playing field for imagery purposes. And certainly, there are many, many bodies, that are emaciated, and have anorexia. And also, there are many people in larger bodies who struggle with the same exact list of, um, issues that someone with anorexia struggles with, but they don't meet the, criteria. So this actually, like, this myth and, my myth number 4 kinda blend together. So I'm gonna jump to that for a second, and I'll just bring these with the explanation into one place. So the number 4 myth that I wrote, and these aren't ranked in any particular order, but that it's only serious if you are emaciated/anorexic. So there's, a thing called the DSM, it's currently on its 5th edition, and that is the, diagnostic criteria for mental illness, and eating disorders are a mental illness. That's something I think people don't commonly know, which we'll talk about a little bit in some other myths, but the criteria for anorexia nervosa in the DSM-5 is that you have to have restriction of energy intake relative to requirements leading to a significantly low body weight in the context of age, sex, developmental trajectory, and physical health. 2, an intense fear of gaining weight or becoming fat, even though underweight. And 3, disturbance in the way in which one's body weight or shape is experienced, undue influence of body weight or shape on self evaluation, or denial of the seriousness of the current low body weight. So, even if all of these criteria for anorexia are not met, a serious eating disorder can still be present. And atypical anorexia includes those individuals who meet the criteria for anorexia, but who are not underweight despite significant weight loss. and research studies have not found a difference in the medical and psychological, I cannot read today, impacts of anorexia and atypical anorexia. And this is coming from Nita. Um, so, where I personally take issue, and a lot of eating disorder providers take issue with this, is that it still like is perpetuating some fat phobia here, because it's like you can only have anorexia if you are basically a certain BMI. And we know how problematic the BMI scale is, and it really can make someone in a larger body, of any proportion that's above like normal body weight, quote unquote, based on the BMI again, which is like so tricky, but unfortunately in the eating disorder world and like for insurance purposes, much like any type of treatment that someone seeks, the BMI is used for criteria. But it's a very disturbing message that like you're not sick enough or you're maybe unworthy of the same type of treatment just based on how your body presents, even though, like Nita stated, I think pretty wonderfully in that quote, that um, despite significant weight loss, they're not underweight. The thing is that we're saying underweight means below a quote unquote normal BMI, but for someone whose body set point and like point they thrive without behaviors is higher than that, they are underweight. It's just that it's not going to look like that on paper, which can make insurance coverage a big issue for people. And so that's an area that is not very well understood because a lot of people would say someone in a larger body could not have anorexia, and they certainly can. It's just going to be labeled atypical, which is really shitty, and I think very harmful. But unfortunately, that is what the DSM says, and that's where we are at. But I think just having awareness of that, because if we are unaware, especially as healthcare providers, that's where that bias can really create harm for someone um, in not getting treatment that they need. Okay. So, my next myth is that someone chooses to have an eating disorder. So, I think that one of my general consensus up to my 29 years of living is that when people can't understand something because it's just so awful and like ideally wouldn't exist, we have to like rationalize these things, and we often do that in very unhelpful ways that help us to cope. So like if we think that someone we care about who has an eating disorder, like that they're choosing to do that rather than it being something they're struggling with for whatever reason, I think that feels better. And this is just an observation. I can't speak for everyone on this, but I think like it's helping to say like, well, they're just choosing not to get better. And I think that applies to a lot of mental health struggles. But it's very, very harmful and wrong to say that about someone, because it is not, no one chooses to have an eating disorder. I will say there are times where people may prefer to be in treatment rather than out of treatment. That is something that may be witnessed at a higher level of care. Again, still not appropriate to say someone's choosing to have an
Well,
eating disorder or any other struggle.
yeah, I mean, like, I was, uh, r recently, we were looking at ways my cat gets really pissy when he doesn't have his food, um, and, like, problematically so. Any other cat owners on this podcasts are like, yes, for sure. But so I was doing some research, and there was a thing that was like your cat is hangry when you it's the break from dinner to breakfast. It's like from 5 p.m. to 8 a.m. It's a long time. So it
Mhm.
was like the explanation was like your cat is hangry, therefore your cat gets so mad. It's so food deprived that its brain, like your cat's mentality, then just it's irrational, and then it will bite and scratch you however it pleases. But basically, all this to say, like we understand that things happen that make you act irrationally, and like at the end of the day we're still like you we are still a society that's like you are still you no matter what. But we do understand more and more that you are the product of like are you the hangriness was just a ironic example. I'm just
Mhm.
basically just saying like there are so many influencing factors on like, you know what I'm saying? You're acting irrational and then you choose to do something through irrationality.
Right.
How much did you choose to do it? But
Yeah. So the really interesting thing that I had no concept of before I really dug into my coursework to specialize in eating disorders is that so obviously someone has to choose to act on the behavior for the first time. Like someone is choosing to purge for the first time. They're choosing to restrict their calories, whether that's like going completely without eating or going on a diet. Um, they're choosing to take a laxative. They're choosing to um, exercise to a dangerous point. Um, which may none of these things may seem dangerous at first, but what we cannot predict is who is going to be genetically predisposed to developing a full-blown eating disorder because most of those things that I just mentioned are inherently disordered if they're being done on a regular basis. But brain structure and function is going to be different in someone who has an eating disorder than someone who does not. And so the way it's been described is that diet and exercise alter the neurochemicals, and that can cause the genetic vulnerability to trigger an eating disorder. And I've heard it said, like, basically, under the right circumstances, which is, I think, like, generally how things with your genetics change for something to develop. It's like basically turning a key to open up the eating disorder where like it always was potentially existing for some people, but under the right circumstances of restriction, whether that's like I said, going on a strict like diet or it's like exercising, purging, laxatives, like ways that are like putting your body out of balance. If you're under those circumstances and your brain is going to develop an eating disorder, like, it can create that perfect storm, because not everybody that, um, goes on diets and exercises too much is going to end up needing eating disorder treatment or having an eating disorder. They just may have an unhealthy relationship with food if they were asked by someone that has opinions on this. Um, so I think that kind of is like a distinction between like the hangry cat example is like a person that's not going to have an eating disorder, um, being like their behaviors being impacted, but and part of that is gonna happen with an eating disorder, but there's actually, like, complete separate functioning that that clicks in when the eating disorder develops, and it happens very rapidly.
yeah, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's like the more we know about
Mhm.
like brains and stuff and decision making and all those chemical processes, the more you realize that it's not body over mind, it's not mind over body, like it's a horribly intertwined, not horribly, it's like a beautifully intertwined
Yeah.
mechanism. And
Yeah. And so obviously in recovery, someone has to make choices for healing for anything, but no one just like sits down and is like, I'm going to have an eating disorder tomorrow. It doesn't work like that.
correct, yeah.
Just like a lot of things we can't wrap our heads around don't work that way.
Myth busted.
Yes. Um, and something else I think that's really important to talk about, kind of as a subcategory of this, is that eating disorders serve as a coping mechanism um, for someone to feel better about something. And when those behaviors they're rewarding in a way, um, for most people. Like, yes, there's a large list of things that are really terrible about eating disorders, but there's always going to be something that was serving that purpose or serving that person, um, like, for the purpose of feeling better, because we all have a lot of coping mechanisms that we use to deal with things, and a lot of them are really maladaptive coping mechanisms, which is certainly what an eating disorder is ultimately. And like, it is serving a purpose for someone. So that also may sound like someone choosing to use that, but I think it's just like having compassion for understanding how we work, and also like remembering the like brain and chemical alterations that are happening that make it pleasant to utilize things, because someone who's purging is going to feel a relief, and it's not just because they emptied their stomach. There's actually like chemical processes that are happening that make it so that that is a rewarding thing, and when you can do something like that that makes you feel better, because people with eating disorders almost always have a co-occurring mental health diagnoses, or diagnosis. Like, obviously, it's going to be hard to let this thing go once you've realized that it's helping you in some way. Okay. Myth number 3. Eating disorders just impact, I put in parentheses, white women. So I added the white part because I think most people would venture to say that eating disorders just impact women. Like, that is probably going to be the first person that most of us think of. Um, Also, marginalized voices, which is not only people who are non-white, but are less likely to be taken seriously and get help. And so that's why I added that in there, because I think that treatment can more easily be pursued by people who have more privilege and access to resources, which again does not always mean that that is a white person, but we know that like, just going to treatment centers, oftentimes that tends to be the majority of the population. Um, so males tend to not get help as quickly. That's what's been found, because we have this like mindset as a society that that is not a disease for men as much as it is for women. And that's very problematic and very untrue. And there's some really interesting statistics, again, from NIDA, that I'm going to pull up. But Nick, I'm curious if you feel open to being vulnerable about like hearing that and like your experience with your own relationship with food and body, like, and this stereotype that men are not supposed to have eating disorders.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on where you are with your masculinity, in terms of like how seriously you take that and how much you value that. I feel like that's the thing that goes with like like, the more you identify with, like, colloquial masculinity, the more you would, be less inclined to, label something an eating disorder, you more you be you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like that's the culprit of it to me, is it
Mhm.
lies in the masculinity,
Mhm.
of it and that association, so, like, to me, it's like just something that males have to work on in that regard because, like, yeah, I don't that one's just like a silly thing that we've built, that needs to be unbuilt. Destroyed is the word,
Mhm.
you know? Any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's hard because I can't talk, obviously, from the male perspective, but I think just thinking of not everyone with an eating disorder necessarily needs higher levels of care, but just thinking of my experience in a higher level of care and it being predominantly white women, um, I think that it would be hard to go into that environment, like you said, because, like, it is a threatening of masculinity because it's not the norm, and so there's so much comparison that happens just being a human being, but then when we add, like, eating disorders on top of that and any other co-occurring mental health issues and just, like, what our culture says we're supposed to be or not be, I would imagine it's very difficult for a male to be in that environment of, like, a bunch of women being asked to share their emotions, and then also you too are being asked to do that in that same setting.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess I'll like, to dissociate it with masculinity a little bit, I feel like anytime the numbers are that lopsided, it's probably just really uncomfortable anyway. So, like, I
Yeah.
could see how, like, oh, being a male, and going like you were saying, talking about, like, getting treatment, going
Mhm.
to a treatment center for it because, like, it's funny, I didn't even my brain was like, "That's not even a possibility. Like,
Mm.
you can't even do that." So, it's, like, clearly still, at force in my mind. So that's really funny. Well, peculiar funny.
Yeah, and, that that who knows how many people hold that belief because I think there's a lot of factors that keep someone from getting care, even when we go past finances of just, like, not understanding what treatment is, even if it's an outpatient basis.
Yeah,
Um,
I would concur.
yeah. I was trying to see if there were I know there are some there's so many really interesting statistics that NEDA provides. I definitely want to talk about some with marginalized voices, but oh, here's one about males. So, males represent 25% of individuals with anorexia nervosa, and they are at a higher risk of dying in part because they are often diagnosed later, since many people assume males don't have eating disorders.
That's crazy. I mean, I wonder too if the statistic, like, how many of them just die and don't get, like, cataloged? Like, is that statistic spot on, or is that even like, would it be
Yeah,
higher if people didn't lie?
yeah, that's a really interesting thing. It also says for anorexia specifically that at any given point in time, between 0.3 and 0.4% of young women and 0.1% of young men will suffer from anorexia. So it's not that much of a discrepancy, which I guess was obvious by 25%. That is basically saying the same thing, just in a little bit of a different way. So, some,
Well, that's funny too, because the way when you use, like, the decimals, I'm like, "Oh, that's
yeah, I
less."
know.
So
I was it those numbers don't seem that big, but then when multiplied, like, by 1,000,000 people, it's
which yeah, no,
it's a lot, and
yeah,
then we
and
have
that's what we're
billions of
dealing with. We have
people.
yeah.
So, those numbers look so tiny, and it's like, "Holy shit," like, this is why I work at a facility that has wait lists. Like, this is why it's hard to get care even when you're seeking it, because there are not a lot of professionals in the grand scheme of healthcare professionals that specialize in this, and a lot of people are struggling. All right, let's talk about a couple things with some statistics around marginalized voices and eating disorders. One thing that I think is really important to highlight is that transgender individuals experience eating disorders at rates significantly higher than cisgender individuals. Um, and I don't know where I was going with that, but compared with heterosexual men, gay and bisexual men had a significantly higher prevalence of lifetime full syndrome bulimia, subclinical bulimia, and any subclinical eating disorder. So just like highlighting how it becomes disproportionately affecting people who have more struggles in our society.
Yeah.
And Black and Latino LGBs have at least as high a prevalence of eating disorders as white LGBs. Okay.
But, like, from what we understand, the treatment is disproportionate to that statistic, correct?
That has been my understanding, but
But
is that what this is saying?
I didn't hear that from what you said. I was just
No, I
asking.
know, I didn't either. I think my
We'll try
eyes
and confirm
were
that
drawn
later.
to that because that's where I was expecting that to go, actually.
Okay, we'll try and get that and put that on later.
Okay. Um, So, despite similar rates of eating disorders among non Hispanic whites, Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians in the United States, people of color are significantly less likely to receive help for their eating issues. So, yes,
That is
that
the
is
okay.
exactly
We
backing
don't
up
have
what that was saying.
we don't have the number there, but
Yep. Okay, so this is the one that is like the most striking to me. Um, When presented with identical case studies demonstrating disordered eating symptoms in white, Hispanic, and African American women, clinicians were asked to identify if the woman's eating behavior was problematic. 44% identified the white woman's behavior as problematic, 41% identified the Hispanic woman's behavior as problematic, and only 17% identified the Black woman's behavior as problematic. And the clinicians were also less likely to recommend that African American women should receive professional help. So I'll put the link for all these statistics because some of them are just like interesting. They're not all like pointing at problems of our society about like who gets access to care or who's paid attention to. I just particularly care about that because it seems as if that's not happening for anyone other than a certain group of white people, depending on what treatment center you enter. And I think that can be very harmful for like feeling like someone belongs somewhere. Like this isn't, I must not have this because I don't look like any of the people here. And again, that's just me speaking for what like one place. But the majority of people I was treating in an outpatient setting that I can recall. So the majority of people I've ever encountered and treated for eating disorders have been white and mostly women.
yeah, that's what I was gonna ask if is it 75-25 women to men?
Mm, I don't think based on what I've seen in treatment,
You would say more.
but yet we know like a
Yeah,
lower
that's what I was
percentage of
saying.
yeah, but yet we know that there's the prevalence is there and just like one person's view of this is that it doesn't seem to be. So if anyone who treats eating disorders has had a different experience, I actually would really love to hear about that because it would be nice to know. And that it's not a knock on my facility or it's just a general like issue that needs to be understood, I think, for
Yeah.
people to be getting well.
Yeah, there's a lot of, like, uh, geography involved in that one too. That would obviously
Yeah,
alter a lot of that, a lot of
for
stuff
sure.
like that, a lot of political nonsense going on behind those statistics that need to be
Yes.
unpacked. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, busted.
Busted. All right. This would be the fourth or
I
fifth
believe
one.
so.
Okay. So I can't control myself around food, therefore I must have an eating disorder. So this is like a myth slash annoyance that came to mind while I was writing this list. This was not verbatim, but a, somewhere along these lines. This was a joke from an Uber driver that I had this year. Asked me what I do. I say I'm an eating disorder dietitian. Well, I eat all the junk food, so I must have an eating disorder.
Oh, I remember that.
I've heard some kind of rendition of this many, many, many times, and I've only been specifically treating eating disorders for like, I don't know, 3 years, like narrowed in on that. And so it it's just disturbing because I think, again, generally speaking, we have a very unhealthy relationship with food as a culture, hence diet culture, hence this podcast and what we're talking about. But like when I say I'm an eating disorder dietitian, this person also like asked me like what does that mean? Like they didn't even like know what kinds of people I'd be working with. And so I think, yes, this is just one person, but this is not an uncommon tale of just not understanding. And like, that's okay. We're not all supposed to know everything. But I think because this is the issue I care like very, very much about, one of them, um, it's disturbing to me that that would be like a reaction because I don't know, it really highlights a lot of problems, but feeling one, it's like, okay, does this person feel like they're out of control with their food? Like, do they need some support? I don't know, kind of sounds like it. But like eating junk food, quote unquote, is like foods inherently are going to have some of them have a higher nutrient density, but all food is going to provide us some form of macronutrients, which is essential to survival, and it is not wrong to eat those foods. So, like, that's just one layer of what was problematic about that statement for me. It was just like, I'm a dietitian. People think dietitians are the food police, like, and this person felt the need to like confess to me that they eat these quote unquote unhealthy foods, which is not, I don't care, first of all, but that's not the norm. Like, I don't know if I was not an eating disorder dietitian and would I have engaged in that conversation? Who knows? I have no idea. But then associating like feeling like you don't do the quote unquote healthy thing with eating, that you might have an eating disorder, but feeling out of control around food is going to happen from any type of restriction, whether that's mental or physical restriction. And that's not like, it can be part of an eating disorder and also can be part of like a lower spectrum struggle with relationship with food. And I never like distinguish those things to say that someone's not struggling because they don't have a full-blown eating disorder. Because I actually like, I think I was saying this at the beginning of the podcast, extend a lot of compassion to anyone who struggles with that because it takes up so much of our time and energy, and it's not like it doesn't have to be that way, and it's not fair that that's how things are. But when we're making like a joke about that, or like I wish I had an eating disorder, is something else that I've heard often, because that's the side where someone's thinking like that's going to help me lose weight, which again is a bunch of nonsense and really like stereotypical commentary. But no, you do not wish you had an eating disorder. I do not care how unhappy you are in your body, like
Yeah.
that, you don't wish that.
Yeah. I
Or you may think that you do, but that's not
just,
appropriate.
like, until you yeah, 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 I mean, like, I feel like a lot of the times that statement would come from somebody who has not had a disordered eating, like they have not gone through that in the similar, and so I feel like it just devalues it when you say, "I can't control myself around food. I must have an eating disorder." It immediately devalues people who have eating disorders.
Yes.
It's really not fair to them. It's
Yes.
like yeah.
Yeah. So that was a very concise way to say the thing that really bugs me about this. And I think it's a lot of just like providing education around it. And I, again, we've talked so many times in this podcast about how we have the opportunities to educate and like break down some of these things. And I did give like a little background of like treating people who have anorexia or bulimia, but I didn't like get into it too much. To my credit, it was 5 in the morning, and I was not interested in having conversation about anything with this person, and it's just a little bit off-putting sometimes when a complete stranger says something like this because, again, it's like one of those things where I have literally no idea how they're gonna respond, and then I'm stuck in the back of this Uber, someone who's taking me to the airport at 5 in the morning, and if I piss them off, like, then, it's a lot of weird dynamics, but I think just in general sparking conversation from these things of like, I don't know. This is what I hope is that when people listen to this podcast, I hope they say something to someone else that helps like a little bit of information be spread. That's like my dream of why I do this. But I think that's the biggest issue here at play is just not understanding the severity of what an eating disorder actually is.
Yeah. Yeah, a fun thing you could say, I think, to if that happened, you could be like, if someone said that sentence, which was, "I can't control myself around food. I must have an eating disorder," go and be like, "Yeah, that's definitely." You could be like, "Yeah, that's definitely something worth unpacking and seeking treatment." Like again, with the like quick quips that can be
Yeah.
looked past, but like, bam. But
Yeah. And my
anyways,
solution was to
no, I'm not.
say literally nothing and not engage further in
Yeah,
conversation because I couldn't walk away.
yeah, really good, like, this is not necessarily, like, an exact example, but, like, the thing, like, there's an Office quote where, Holly says things haven't, like, and this is another marginalized group that was unfairly used in sentences as jokes, but she says, like, "Things haven't been going so well with men, maybe I should try women." And
Mhm.
Oscar is a homosexual man in the show, and he says, "Oh, so you think it's a choice?" And then she gets absolutely, like, mortified, and then she, like, tries to walk herself out of this. Similar, like, anytime someone uses a marginalized group as their punchline,
Yep.
that's what happens, but I started that with a point, and that was, uh,
I mean, you
that
made a
it's
point.
yeah,
That's
it's
not
the
okay
same.
to use marginalized people
Yeah, and that
as a
and I think the
punchline.
specific point I was trying to make with what you were saying about not saying anything is that, uh, is the place where Oscar is there
Oh.
as marginalized. Like, you are also somebody who has been through that stuff, and so, like,
Mhm.
that's do you wanna have to divulge your trauma to this guy to
Oh,
get past
absolutely
this?
not.
But anyways, we've
Yeah.
we've talked about that issue,
Yeah.
so we can move
Yeah.
on. We can
Absolutely.
bust that myth and move on to the next one.
Okay. Next myth. I've seen them eat, so they don't have an eating
Oh dear
disorder.
God.
So this is again, like, I think people this is something I have heard from someone, a caregiver of a loved one who has an eating disorder in my course of time. Um, and this is something that came up too when I was just like Googling some common eating disorder myths of just like downplaying the severity of things of like, can't be that bad because I saw them um eat something. And like if someone struggles with restriction, it doesn't mean that they never eat anything. Like, it can mean that for a certain point of time, and obviously, if there's not intervention very quickly, that isn't gonna work out. But feeling like it's quote unquote just not that bad, um, like someone with an eating disorder may feel like they have to hide things, because it is obviously understood that having an eating disorder is not a positive thing, and to protect that, it's very common to hide it, to try and hide behaviors because there's a lot of shame tied with it. And also, if you don't want someone bothering you and asking you to like not do the thing you're doing that you're wanting to do, in part because your brain has changed and also you're getting any kind of reward from it, like of course, there's gonna be times where you may show up differently in front of people, and that's not uncommon at all, and so I think it's just, again, a matter of, like, thinking that this is black and white, and eating disorders probably mostly exist in gray, and that's just a really unfair, statement to make because it's not gonna be accurate. Um, Someone who's struggling with an eating disorder may also eat something that is considered a quote unquote fear food, or like what we were talking about, a lot of those quote unquote junk foods. Like that could be something that someone consumes and it completely like wrecks them because they did it. But if you just witness that piece, why would you think anything was wrong with that person?
I
And
mean,
it's just not accurate.
yeah, this one is just so atrocious, right? Like, it's not
Yeah.
even from a logical point, it's a fallacy. Like, if
Mhm.
eating can be part of an eating disorder, so seeing someone eat does not confirm someone has an eating disorder. Like, it's not, and if seeing someone eat is proof that they don't have an eating disorder, then the solution would be never eating is the way to solve eating disorders. It's a nonsensical statement. It doesn't Yeah.
Yeah, and I think even for someone who's struggling, if they have, like, a good day, like a good recovery day, where they might, like, meet their full meal planner, like, they don't use laxatives or they don't purge, like, it can create really quickly this false sense of things being better than they are, and sure, like, it's really great to celebrate little wins, but, like, we really like, you need to see patterns over time of things improving before you can ever say you're doing well. Like, you can be doing well in the moment, but I do think that that is another slippery slope of, like, we see something look normal for, like, a second, and then we just because I think we're generally speaking beings that want things to be going well and for people not to be, like, destroyed, that it can be easier to be like, "Oh, this isn't a big deal." And I think that kind of, like, falls in line with this. Alright. Are we busted? Do I have permission?
Yeah, that myth, you know my stance on that one.
Okay. So next one that and again, this is pertaining to, um, someone who can get a period, so it's a little bit exclusive of certain people, but that it's normal to lose your period, just, advice can be to just take birth control to regulate it. Um, this is something I've heard from way too many women. I've seen it a lot from other providers. I've heard this from people that, like, lose their period due to weight dropping or overexercise. There certainly are other reasons why someone's period, could go away that does not have anything to do with an eating disorder. But, um, in this particular instance, it like, the female athlete triad is, like, this is very common, like, for runners, for example, who, um, are clocking extensive mileage, and it's really hard to fuel that, I ran one half marathon in my life, and the amount of food that my body was asking from me was ridiculous, and I did lose weight at that time, not on purpose, but it's very common. Again, I wanna be really careful to say that that is not always going to be the case, because all bodies are gonna respond differently, but, um, that's not good. That's not cool when that happens. Um, just because you don't lose your period does not mean you're not struggling with these things. So again, like, not wanting to ever take validation away from someone, but to lose it because your body is not getting what it needs, and for it to be, like, overlooked of, like, let's just put you on something to regulate your hormones, that's very dangerous. Um, and yeah, that one's just, like, a quick thing of, like, absolutely not. It's not normal to lose your period. Something
Busted.
is wrong. Okay, what did you say?
Busted.
Thank you. Alright,
Welcome.
so the last one that I wanna talk about today is that we're supposed to eat healthy and be disciplined about exercise. So, this I've heard from people who are struggling with eating disorders and, like, caretakers and just, like, in general, people obviously think this, a lot of the time because of our culture, but the fear of healing relationship with food leading to a body that isn't controlled is a really big barrier in our society for getting help. And that's a fallacy in and of itself just because like we don't have 100% control over what our bodies look like. I don't know what percentage of control we have of what they look like. I don't think that's been defined, but we don't just like have the ability to look however we want. Some people are born with the body type that can easily be manipulated into if not just existing that way, can be manipulated into looking the way that whatever our current societal type is, we can manufacture that depending on someone's, genetics and their body structure, but diet culture, is like that systemic fear that's tied with it of being in a larger body, and it can also very much be a main driver of someone's eating disorder, so, like, the desire to be healthy and be disciplined, like we were talking about, for some people, that's what can unlock your eating disorder, and so that idea that that's just, like, how we're supposed to be, it's actually not healthy. Sorry, I have to set an alarm now because I'm anemic in my pregnancy, and I have to remember to take my iron. Um
Do you wanna go take it right now? Or
No,
you want
I'll
me to
do it when we're
remind you when we're
done.
done?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, that it's not, um, something that we inherently need to be doing. Certainly good self-care things to, if you're able to, have the ability to pay attention to nutrition in a way that is not feeling restrictive or controlling, like, there's nothing wrong with that, like, that can be really positive. And to move your body, that can be very positive, but this idea of, like, it's good or bad based on how I eat and the discipline around it, like, that is just, like, the whole myth of this podcast, really, but that really can play into eating disorders and other people's opinions about how someone gets care based on their body size and what they're actually allowed to do in their work with healing, which is super problematic and not true.
Myth busted.
Okay. So, I wanna just review some warning signs and symptoms of eating disorders because this is an educational episode specifically, and these are all from, Veritas. There's a really nice handout I acquired somewhere in my work, but, signs and symptoms: losing or gaining weight, preoccupation with weight/appearance, preoccupation with food, fad diets, and calorie counting, excessive exercise, sleep disturbance, distracted/unable to focus, mood changes, depression, anxiety, social isolation, frequent standing, pacing, fidgeting, fatigue, fainting, dizziness, or lightheadedness. So, certainly, just because someone has some of these symptoms does not mean they have an eating disorder. However, the there should be a lot more screening for eating disorders happening, especially in our healthcare system that's constantly promoting weight loss, which I already have a problem with, but a lot of these things are gonna come up for somebody that is pursuing weight loss, and like I said, whether or not they're going to go on to develop an eating disorder or not, these things, if these are symptoms and signs, like, that something is wrong, then why are we purposefully, like, putting people through this? Because we're fat phobic, basically. So, um, it is always worth, like, checking it out. Like, if you're a healthcare provider and you see these things and you're not feeling super like you would know what to do or what to look for, look into that. If you're a human being who knows any human beings, like, just to be aware of these things because, like we've uncovered, it's not as uncommon as we think for someone to have an eating disorder. It can affect any and every type of body. And when we catch eating disorders early, the chances of full recovery significantly increase, and it's important to pay attention to. And this shit is scary, and that, like, I never wanna come across as a fear monger, but, like, we're talking about why diet culture is spooky in this series, and, like, having an eating disorder is probably the spookiest of them all, and needs to be better understood and represented so that people can get the appropriate help that they need.
Fact validated.
All right.
Sick. I have a quick laundry bag for you. Just a few things. Before we wrap up, I think that is the direction we were headed.
Yes.
Cool. Okay. Do this all the time. So I just want to say you opened up and you talked about emaciated bodies,
Mhm.
and we all the time talk about larger bodies.
Mhm.
And just real quick, props to the word bodies, because when I think about bodies versus the word people, really like just think it's a better lens of looking at it. You talk about sometimes we talk about this being our vessel, um, our body being our vessel,
Mhm.
and whatnot. And I do think a lot of people would like be okay with that as a concept, at least from like an appearance standpoint. Your body being your vessel, and when you use the term bodies, then like it kind of walks back that you are what your body is. Like every time you say to me, every time I hear bodies versus person, like it heals my relationship with uh, the obsession, the weight obsession, and viewing people and how you view people. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So props to the term bodies. That gets my approval. I like using that term when describing things,
Yeah, and
specifically bodies.
I think that applies for the way we talk about a lot of things in our society is just being very careful to take that step back and make sure that we're not representing it in a way that's really harmful rather than, like, calling it what it is.
Yeah, and yeah, you totally understand if you're like, give me a break. But like it's so like helpful, I think, to see. It's so like healing and positive and inclusive and encouraging and loving to use the word bodies. Um, that was just an observation. Second thing that is also kind of just an observation. I just enjoy the memes that are so. what trended like a few years ago, what was really a trend, I like for everyone was like, can you name it? Then don't eat it. That was a big trend that went in terms of ingredients, not like potatoes, but in terms of like pick up a can of processed Oscar Mayer ham, and if you don't know exactly what every ingredient on there is, it's not you can't eat that. It's not
Mhm.
good for you, and it is in the unholy pile.
Mhm.
But recently, this like you posted it on your Instagram today, and this field of memes has been popping up where people they're like they combat that with sort of a silly approach, and they'll name a bunch of astronomically impossible to pronounce words and be like, those are the chemical compounds that make up broccoli.
Yeah. So the post that Nick's referring to is Anna Sweeney, who's a eating disorder dietitian, goes by Dietitian Anna on Instagram. She posted, if you are unable to pronounce the ingredients on a food label, you are also unlikely to be able to pronounce the chemical compounds that comprise foods that are not accompanied by labels. And she went on to like list a long list of big words. And she was like, "Could you easily pronounce these? It's certainly challenging for me. These are the chemical compounds present in avocado oil." And I was like, "Bam!"
But yeah, that's a fun one. Yay, that meme. I think that is sort of an anti-diet culture meme that helps
Yeah.
reframe that lens a little bit. So laugh at that meme, spread that meme. Um,
Yes. Spread memes
and
that aren't harmful. Love that.
very true. Uh, okay, so here's my final thing.
Okay.
I always talk about what we see, because diet culture be popping. See it a lot around you. But I was driving on my street the other day, and I saw a bumper sticker on a car that said, it said, "Don't park too close. I'm fat." And immediately when I read that, I was offended, just because like I have a like a I'm a like skinny privileged person who's anti-fat, or sorry, who is no, sorry, who is anti-fat phobic. Yes, that is what I am. So you have this like you approach it, you know what I'm saying, where you're
Yep.
like ha ha ha,
Yep.
and then I like thought about it for a second, and I was like, obviously that could be the wrong thing, um, but like also I was like, oh dang, that ties into our thing about like inclusivity we talked about last week, where we were like, oh my gosh, like just another thing I don't ever like do enough, and like that's actually if someone is in a larger body, that's actually super helpful. And like if you had that on your car and people were actually like, oh, parked a little bit to the right, like that would actually be super helpful. And like again, another thing that like people don't count at all for people who aren't fitting the normal. What's your opinion on that bumper
I
sticker?
first had a negative reaction just because, like, I'll admit that I've been trained that when most people use the word fat in our
Yes.
society, they're using it in a really negative way, and that's why I think it's so lovely for people in larger bodies to, um, like, take back that word because it's not
Yeah.
wrong, it's not bad, it should not have any negative connotations, and that is quite lovely, like, a way of, like, just asking for something that you need in a world that doesn't consider access. Because we did talk about that of just, like, car sizes. I think you had brought that one up in your list of examples of not being very inclusive, and, yeah, if you have a car that's not inclusive to all bodies and you park them all next to each other, is that gonna be comfortable? No.
No, yeah, and that's such a, like, commonly I went to a hockey game in DC last week, and I had to park in a DC parking garage, and that's an example of, like, oh, the cities, you have to smash every car next to each other, like, it has to be done that way, and that's, like, yeah, there you go,
Yeah.
yet another thing to be combated, but so
So, I really hope
yeah,
that that is, like, someone genuinely, like, asking for something, like, self-advocating. I hate that that has to be a thing because I just find that
concur.
trash, and also, it could be a really positive thing.
Yeah, if you're please, the person who owns that bumper sticker, yeah, obviously dictates like how I view it. Like, please don't be a joke, please. But if
Yeah.
that's like a genuine thing, like kind of sick. I was
Yeah.
like, uh, yeah, that's all I have for you. So I will let you wrap this up.
Okay. Well, thank you guys very much for listening. This was the last installment of our spooky season series on why diet culture is spooky. I've probably said the word spooky more times than I needed to for this month. But next episode, it is body positivity
Ooh,
week.
non-spooky topic.
I know. Let me see. Let me go to my saved. I saved this. Excuse me of the hiccups. Post from the Body Positive. They're actually doing a collaboration with the brand Me Undies, which is really cool. But it is Be Body Positive week from November 1st through the 5th. And I don't know if this is a national thing actually, now that I'm saying this out loud, or if this was just something that they did. So let me see if that's like a real thing. But either way,
We're gonna celebrate
I
it.
want to celebrate it. So the reason that I'm sharing that is for anyone who's listening in real time, I would love to hear from you via email, through my website, through Instagram. All the things can be found on my Instagram at dietitian Dani Cast. Like what things have helped you to be more body positive, and to like regard others in a more body positive, and like it can be neutral to positive, like whatever feels like it fits for you. But I would love to share some of those things from other people because I like to hear what other people have to say, not just myself, in this podcast forum.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's everything.
I don't know if this is a real thing, but we're celebrating it anyway.
We're celebrating.
All right. Talk to you guys next week. Thank you for listening. Diet Culture is co-produced by myself and my brother, Nick Lewis. You can keep up with what's going on with Diet Culture on my Instagram page at Dietitian Dani Cast. If you prefer to watch rather than just listen, check us out on YouTube, and we always love ratings and reviews if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much for your support, and can't wait to talk to you next week.